Awesome. Welcome back, guys. Welcome back to the channel. I have the absolute pleasure and honor today to be joined by an internet sensation. Is that going too far? Calling you an internet sensation. This is Isaac, right? And Isaac, you can follow him on Instagram. He's my underscore language underscore thoughts. And if I'm not mistaken, you set up your Instagram account like a month ago or not even. How long have you had this account?
Pretty recently, a few weeks ago I started making maybe 2 months ago I started making random tongue twister videos just to figure out how to use the app. But the first reel that I really made is probably 3 weeks ago.
Sure. And is that the one we're about to talk about? Because this is the one that really caught my eye. I was just scrolling through as you do. I mean, unfortunately, like many, we're all addicted to the scroll, aren't we? So I was there scrolling through and I saw Isaac's face pop up, right? No idea who this guy is. And he says, "Do you know manzana doesn't actually mean apple?" And I was like, I had that initial reaction of what was he talking about? Like manzana or manzana, if you're speaking Mexicano. Manzana means, of course, it means apple. What's he talking about? And then very quickly in the video, you explained yourself of what you were talking about when you said, no, manzana doesn't mean apple. And he gets out an apple and he says, this is manzana. Do you want to just explain a little bit about that video? Because I remember I wrote on the comments straight away, I was like, mate, check your DMs because I knew the video was going to blow up because it was such a good, like, polarizing, clever video. I messaged, I was like, check your DMs, mate, because I want to talk to you because we share a lot of things in common. I watched a couple of your other reels as well about listening as well, where you can learn a language just by listening to it. And I'm like, yeah, 100%. Uh, but talk to me a little bit about that reel. Like, what do you mean when you say
Yeah.
manzana is an apple, or what does that mean?
Yeah, it's really funny. Polarizing, the word you used, is literally it. I did not expect it to be so polarizing. That was the second reel I ever posted, really, and yesterday it hit 1 million views, which is just kind of crazy.
Mm.
Um, so the idea behind it is, and I was going at a US based audience, especially English speaking, and I know the same applies to England and other English speaking countries, but we all have this huge bias when we learn languages, especially in countries where most of us haven't learned a language to a high degree in school. The bias is that we tend to relate the language we're learning directly to the language that we already speak, but not just in a way that helps us to understand, more in a way that puts us on a crutch for learning the new language. So, for example, I've taught a lot of people. I used to teach Spanish. I've taught a lot of people Spanish where they're trying to translate not only everything they say, but everything they hear. And so they're really playing this game of tennis with themselves as they try and speak a language. And it takes so much more mental capacity, and it's just so much more tiring, and it's also a lot slower. And so a lot of people are saying, I just can't understand what people are saying because they don't give me enough time to think about it. When in reality, the reality is we need to learn languages without thinking about the translation. So the idea behind the apple manzana is, when you hear the word manzana in Spanish, you need to think about the object. You don't need to be thinking about what that means in English. The real meaning of the word is the thing they're talking about. And we get too caught up in translating to English before we know what it actually means.
Right. And I often say to my clients, it's like another skill in and of itself, right? Translating from English into Spanish. It's a real high level skill that if you want to be a language learner, if you want to like get fluent in Spanish, you really don't need to do that. You can cut out the middleman, like you said, by just going, okay, well, this isn't, or like this, like this isn't teléfono means telephone, and then this is telephone. This is a telephone. You just go, okay, this is teléfono, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah.
brain gets it. You bypass that, you cut out the middleman with it. Yeah, and like you
Yeah.
said, it's just so much easier to think in a language because if you want to speak a language fluently, you've got to think. in a language first and foremost. A lot of people they don't unfortunately like the novices they don't do it. They try and go the hard route and they try to like translate every single thing, which
Hmm.
is just yeah.
And you're right when you call it the hard route because like you said, it's a high level skill. And so for I've done translation. I did translation for a medical company in Guatemala between English and Spanish, and it's hard. You really have to practice. Being fluent in both languages does not mean that you can translate between the two, especially real time. It's a huge skill, and that's why you'll get so many people who've spoken two languages since birth. They have two native languages, and they can't do it. They know the meaning of the word in both languages, but they can't connect. And that's totally fine because speaking is not about translating, right? If you want to be able to translate, that's an extra skill that you've got to acquire, but it's separate and it's harder.
Yeah, for sure. And monolinguals, people who've no experience learning foreign languages, they take this for granted, right? Don't they? I think everyone's had that experience when you learn a language. Say, I speak Spanish, right, as you do. And I remember being in Spain with my parents, and they'd like be like, "Oh, what does this mean?" Like they get me to translate all this like great big text, and it's so difficult. It's so clunky for me to read it, and I'm like, "Yeah, I understand that," because I understand, for example, what's a good example of this. Kind of like where false friends and false cognates come in, like realizar. Do you know? I know like
Uh-huh.
realizar, I know what that means. But obviously, if you go to your English brain, it wants to translate it into realize,
And it's
which
not.
which is it's not really that
Well, it's one version of realize, right? But it's not darte cuenta. It's not that kind of realize.
exactly. Exactly. It's to realize something like to yeah, to make something happen or you
Uh-huh.
get into these like sticky situations when you realize, yeah, it's a real skill, being able to
Hmm.
think quickly. And we have it with like phrasal verbs as well. I don't know if you experienced much of this with your uh, English or your American students learning Spanish when they were trying to translate words like get. Like, tell me a little bit about
Oh,
your
that's
experience
the worst
teaching.
one. Get is
Yeah.
the worst word in English. It means everything.
How
So
do you navigate that when you're teaching or when you were teaching? When they say,
so
"Oh, how do you say get?" Oh, I want to get. I don't know. I need to get.
that problem
Mm,
comes all the way down from the base level. So that misconception is that we need to learn how to say what we say in our native language in the new language, when in reality, what you need to learn is how to communicate in the new language. It's not about word for word being able to say what you know here, here. So for example, when they ask
when
how to say to get, right? It's what they're really asking, or what they should be asking, is how do I say this? How do I express this idea? So let's say I want to give me an example with to get. I don't know.
like get up, for
All
example.
right, all right. Get up. All right, that's a great phrasal verb. So, they don't want to know how to say to get. They want to know how to say to get up, or the idea of either standing up, waking up, and it all depends on the context, right? And so to get is way too broad to learn all of that at once. Let's put that aside. Let's learn how to say what you want to say to get up. So it's probably levantarse in Spanish. Um, it could be different depending on even more context, but let's learn what you want in context. Ignore the rest. You'll learn that later. Learn what you need right now.
And you've touched on something super important in thinking in ideas. This is something I wasn't aware of actually. I was made aware of it by one of my students years and years ago when I was teaching English in Spain. One of my students was trilingual, and at that point, I was like, "Oh my God, this guy speaks really good English, really good Spanish, fluent, completely fluent French and Catalan as well. I think he was a Catalan speaker." And he told me, he said, the secret is you don't think in words, think in ideas. And I was like, bro, that's so true. That is so true. That's one of the major skills that polyglots, they may not be aware of it. Most of them probably aren't, but they're very, very good at taking an idea because it's normal to have the initial thought in English. You have a thought, which is an idea expressed in words, but you need to kind of step back from it and be like, okay, what am I really trying to say? here and start
Yeah.
to think in ideas and communicate from there. And then if you can take an idea and then use the words that you've already got in the language you're learning, say in Spanish, this brings in other problems, of course, with people because they don't want to speak like they're a kid. That's another thing you have to really let go of, right? When you're learning a language, you have to start from that level.
You
People,
got to be
adults,
humble.
yeah. Talk to me about that, like the humility that language learning can bring.
All right, so now we're getting into one of the biggest misconceptions, another one of the biggest misconceptions that people have when learning a new language, and that is that it's all about perfection. And I don't want to offend school teachers because there's a lot of people who watch probably both of our content who are teachers, maybe teaching Spanish in high school, for example. And I personally believe that school has messed up our brains when we think about learning languages. And the reason I say that is because it's all about the grade. So if I spell it wrong, that's points off. If I pronounce it wrong, if I forget a word, if I incorrect grammar, right? When have we ever graded our kids when they say like I hungry instead of I'm hungry, right? When are you going to say, no, I'm not going to give you food until you say it right? You forgot the verb. No, that's not how we do it because it's just about communication. And so people get so afraid to mess up. They don't want to sound dumb. I understand, but the reality is when you learn a new language, you've got to put everything behind you and just go for it. The most important thing is that you understand them and that they understand you. And once you get there, then you can learn a lot faster. Before you get there, just do it however you can, make it work, and it'll come. That's what I think.
We have exactly the same thoughts. You voice my thoughts a lot more eloquently than I voiced mine, and in an American accent instead of a British one. So that points off for that. But you're
Points
literally
off.
saying, you're saying all the same things I've been trying to like get through to people over the past, certainly over the past 5 years since I've been running laid back languages and teaching foreign languages to native English speakers. So many good points there, man. School. Did you end up reading that the book? Have you downloaded it?
Yeah,
My book.
no, I haven't.
I mean, it's yeah, all the same points. I talk also about obviously the perfectionism, which is such a disease, but especially with regards to language learning. As you know, any language learner, successful language learner, let's say someone who's learned a language or multiple languages fluently, they know the only way you're ever going to learn a language is by taking those steps. The steps are the mistakes themselves. This is what people don't get because we're conditioned in school to be afraid of them, which is, and don't worry about upsetting teachers, by the way. I've already done that with all the half the videos I make are about how rubbish school was and how it's,
Uh,
traumatized us, like making mistakes. And how do you how do you get over that? How did you get over that? Like that conditioning from school? Was there like are you conscious of the process you took with that? Were there
Getting
steps?
over the mistake mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, being afraid of making mistakes. Or were you kind of naturally just like, yeah, whatever, I know school's a load of crap, whatever. I'm just gonna make my mistakes and learn myself. Was
So
there like reconditioning that went on for you or
oh yeah. So I have a little bit of a unique experience because I took 4 years of Spanish in school and I was one of the best in my class. A lot of people are like, oh, I failed all my Spanish classes and now I'm fluent. That wasn't me. I was pretty good and like comparatively, but at the end of the day, I could not understand almost any spoken Spanish, and it took me a super long time to express myself. So then I moved, after high school, I moved to Guatemala for a year and a half. This was a huge volunteer trip that I did. But the reality was, when I got to Guatemala, it was the first time the language was real for me. So in school, nothing is about real meaning. It's all about the language. So, all right, let's read this story about, I don't know, Jack and Jill, right? That it's not about the story, it's about the Spanish that's used in the story or the French or the whatever you're learning. The reality is languages are used with real people to express real ideas, to really communicate. native Spanish speakers are not thinking as they're talking, oh, I'm speaking Spanish. This is Spanish practice. I'm getting better at my accent. That's not it, because they're thinking in real life. That's the world. So getting to Guatemala for me, and you don't have to go to another country to do this, but what you do need to do is you need to have a language interaction where the main goal is not just the language. So when I'm trying to think of when I originally started to get past it. I think it's when I started to talk to people that I was actually like enjoying the conversation, talk to people who were teaching me something that wasn't Spanish. So maybe teaching me a different way to cook that I'd never heard of, or maybe explaining an idea about the government, or teaching me something, telling me something crazy that happened in the news that I hadn't heard. Those are the moments where and this is the real, I needed a word for this. When you get in the zone, right? Um, and it's when you forget that you're even speaking in the language. When you're so interested in what you're listening to, talking about, reading, that you forget about the language entirely. And then mistakes are so trivial as long as understanding is achieved, right? So, for example, I started learning French last February, and I'd say I'm at a pretty solid level. I'm definitely not perfect. I'm fluent in a lot of cases, but everyone has complicated scenarios where they're not. I just recently last week started listening to Harry Potter in French, which is awesome because not only is it super nostalgic childhood memories coming back, but it's real content that I enjoy. It's not just about learning French. And so what I've noticed is as I listen, just driving or walking to and from who knows where, I I um I can completely understand the story and what's going on, even though I don't understand every word. And it's because I'm in that zone and I forget about the language and I'm only interested in the content. And that's where your brain really picks up new words, really grows fast.
Yeah, man. You're speaking my language, pun intended. Like honestly, everything you're saying about being it's not just about the language, language learning is obvious that it's not all about the language. We focus so much on like the language, but it's so much more than that. I go on about connection and communication, and emotionally getting emotionally invested in a language, which you would if you like listen to Harry Potter. You mentioned about, oh yeah, it took me back to my childhood, and you're just there, you're listening to the Harry Potter story. And also, what I loved what you said, but I listen, but I don't understand every word, you know. But that's all right because that's another thing people obviously condition from school.
Oh
Thanks a
yeah.
lot, school.
Oh man.
You know, I'll tell my clients, okay, yes, listen to. I start them off 20 minutes of podcast every day, and they come back to me after the first week of doing that, and they go, yeah, yeah, it's good, but I don't like, I don't understand it like everything, and I'm like, yeah, and it's not about understanding everything, like
Mhm.
you don't need to understand every word. That's also the beauty about that repetition and using like spaced repetition. Eventually, you do understand more or less everything, but then you also realize that you don't understand every single word in your native language. If someone's speaking like, on the radio or even on a podcast or speaking to someone from a different country, they've got a different accent. You don't understand every single word that they're saying. You don't make out every single word, but you're not fixated on that because you're
Mhm.
fixated. You're thinking about the content, what they're saying. You know, it's
Yeah.
important, I feel, to get like emotionally involved in a language.
Yeah.
Think, get involved, like really want with your heart to like learn the language, but to learn it because of other reasons other than, oh, look at me, I speak French, look how cool I am. You've got to have at least three strong reasons to like want to learn that language. Out of curiosity, what were your three, if you can give me three, or like what were your reasons for like learning French? Why did you decide? Obviously, you
That's
spoke Spanish. That's a Romance language already, so it's like, yeah, we'll give French a
yeah.
try. Or
That's a great question. So I have some pretty strong ones with French. Before I get
cool.
into that, I wanted to mention that loving loving language learning should actually not be one of your reasons. And it's sad because people like you and me, we love language. It's so fascinating, language learning. But if you like, wanting to be a polyglot is not enough, or wanting to, I love language learning. For example, I started learning Korean and I got to a pretty good level in it, but I never got fluent in Korean. And it's because I didn't have any reason besides, oh, I want to know another language. And that only gets you so far until you realize you run out of passion or you find it along the way. But French went a lot better for me because my wife speaks French. So this is interesting. My wife is from Mexico. We speak in English because her English is almost perfect. She started learning when she was a kid. Um, but she also went on a study abroad to France when she was in high school. And so ever since we've been married about 2.5 years, ever since being married, she's wanted to go back. And we both just finished up school, college, but before graduating, we really wanted to go on a study abroad together to France. And I mean, we picked France because that's the one that she knew, and she was going to be showing me her world. And so it's funny. French was actually a language that I never wanted to learn, and it's because it has a really bad reputation as far as the culture towards new language learners, right? So everyone's like, "Oh, the French, they've got no mercy." If you go to Latin America, everyone's like, "Wow, your Spanish is so good." If you go to France, supposedly, everyone's like, oh, you got it wrong, you stupid tourist, like you stop trying to speak my language, right? So I didn't want to learn French because I thought, well, that's not going to be fun. But now that I had a reason to get to know my wife's world, right, to go study there, to learn about, it was like a culture, art, language, all combined into the purpose of the study abroad. I studied marketing in college, but it had nothing to do with marketing. It was just to learn about France. So that was my reasoning. Was it was very much, I want to learn this language so I can go to this country and understand and really get meaning out of my experience there.
Mm. That's awesome. That's awesome. And what you said about the French, the French people and their reaction, how has that been? Have you ever had many interactions with the French, or just
So
you speak to your wife in French and that's it?
I I don't want to sound, don't get me wrong. I never had problems with any, and I was in Paris. Like that's the people say Paris is the worst, but
Yeah.
I never had problems with people, insulting me, not understanding me. Pretty much every conversation I ever had worked out really well. And I have a feeling that the myth of the French are jerks and they hate when you, I think that that comes from the other side of, at least American tourists. I'd be willing to bet American tourists are way worse than British tourists, or, from the United Kingdom or anywhere else. I I think that there's this huge problem with Americans thinking that they speak a language that they really don't know well, and being a little bit too confident and a little bit too loud. And those people are the ones who run into problems. I never had any issues. I think the French people were wonderful.
I'm glad you said it. I'm glad you said it. I didn't say anything. You said it, yeah. But
Yeah.
I agree. I think so. And certainly similar to yourself, I've never had any problems with French people, and I lived kind of around Paris. I went hitchhiking in France when I was 19. So I
Wow.
traveled a lot of France, spoke to a lot of different people, obviously, and I had nothing but great positive reactions from French people. Um, and that's a really important point you've touched on there. Like, okay, yeah, Americans not really knowing how to speak French, but go into France to speak their French. They've in that example they've made it about themselves, and about
Mm,
them speaking the language, and it's all about ego. Um, and I think that's a big difference with people such as ourselves. Like if you put the people before the language, you get a completely different interaction with them. I
yeah.
teach my clients quite early on in the process, not super early on, but fairly early on, slang words, because I find slang words are incredible icebreakers. If you can speak to a French person, there's a big difference between, well, I mean, French is a lovely example because you've kind of got like textbook French, you've got
Oh
formal
yeah.
French, you got informal French, you got verlan, like which is
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
language when they switch it around, as you'll know very well. Like verlan for me, that was the thing that opened my heart up to French. I was like, this is so cool because we don't have that in English. You just can't. Well, not in my dialect anyway. Maybe in like the Caribbean or something, they might do something like
Uh-huh.
that. But there's no concept of verlan. So I loved it, and I would just ask my friends and ask people, "Oh, how do you say this? Is there a word for this in verlan?" And the reactions you get off of people, once you show them that you care about them, you care about their culture, they're so much more receptive and they
Hmm.
want to help you. It's just when there's that, especially when you're in Paris, and I can imagine like your typical American or English tourist would go and want to order like a croissant or something like that. They say, "Oh, je voudrais
Yeah.
prendre un." It's for the someone who's like working, they're earning how I don't know, $10 an hour or whatever, working in a patisserie, and they just want that. Yes, what okay, what do you want? You know, you can imagine
Hmm.
they don't want to teach you a language. This is another thing I'm very like insistent. My guys become their own teachers and realize you can pull out loads of information from people, but you have to become your own teacher in a way and not rely on other people to teach
Hmm.
you. Is that something similar you've experienced about when you learn a language? You've got to learn the language yourself. You use people and things as resources, but you've got to become the teacher and the learner. If that makes
Yeah.
sense. Is
Yeah.
that been your
100%.
experience as well? Similar?
I'm actually about to make a reel. Who knows? Maybe in the next few days it'll come out about just that. I taught Spanish to people living abroad all over Latin America, in Spain, even in the US. I taught Spanish for years, and even though that's true, you don't want me to be your Spanish teacher. And that's a funny thing to say. People are going to be like, oh, it's because your Spanish sucks, or it's because you're not a native speaker. That's not it. You don't want me to be your English teacher either. You actually don't want a Spanish teacher or an English teacher. What you want is a coach. And you said this the other day. I really liked how you used the word coach, because one person is not going to teach you the language. You have access to the entire world of the internet and books and people, as long as you're respectful. But and so why would you rely on one person to teach you a language? You're going to want to learn on your own. Use anything, and find a person that can guide you in your resources, but don't don't try to depend on one person. You know, I had Spanish teachers in school that really didn't speak Spanish. You know, I've heard some accents that I didn't know if they were right or wrong, but they were wrong, right? And that's okay. Everyone's at their own level, but if you only use one source of input, you're going to be really biased, and you're going to probably run into a lot of problems.
Mm-mm. Yeah, man. You're preaching. You're preaching to the converted here, man. Honestly, I'm like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, and like you said, doesn't really matter. Um, if a teacher say like high school teachers have got like a bad accent, you can learn things from
Mhm.
them. But yeah, but you don't want to have one sole like this is my teacher. And also I feel that I've since well working in Spain, I was still like I call myself a teacher or like professor or whatever because that was my role. But certainly since doing layback languages, I've dropped the label teacher a long time ago because that's not what I am. I'm a coach, and I find that the dynamic between a teacher and a student, again, this might link back to school being, not optimal for true learning, is very much like the teacher is up here, right? And the teacher holds all this knowledge and it's the source of all this knowledge. And it kind of they trickle it down to you. And you're there like trying to eat this bits of like knowledge and like, yeah, oh lovely, great. Yeah. Oh, am I worthy? Am I good enough? Yeah. Oh, I made a mistake there. Oh no. A coach will come down to you, meet you at your level where you're at. And what I do is I speak to people, I guess like mothers and like parents do with their kids, just above their level.
Mhm.
That's the sweet spot. If you can find a teacher or a coach who does that, who speaks to you, repeats what you're saying so you can hear it back to yourself, corrects you, but does it in a way that is not like how can I explain this? Not like highlighting the mistake, because people do that to themselves because of their conditioning, right? You make a mistake, they're like, oh God, I've made a mistake. And teachers will kind of be like, that's wrong. Do you know? They highlight what's wrong, do they
Wait, wait,
not? Rather
stop,
than
stop. Don't talk. Let's go back to this mistake. Forget what you were saying. I know it was important. No, like it's not fun that way.
exactly. And like we're saying before, it makes it, the language is the most important thing rather than the point of the a language, in real life. It's just communicating,
Yeah.
communicating, expressing your ideas. I feel like this is a big, big point, which once you can kind of get or like recondition yourself to not be afraid of making mistakes. Maybe that could be one of the big things. Have you like how do you feel when you make a mistake now? Or do you even perceive mistakes as mistakes when speaking, let's
So
say let's say French, for example?
yeah, okay, so French is a good example because in Spanish I developed a really bad habit of wanting to be absolutely perfect and I still think about it. And it's funny because usually I can communicate without mistakes, but I still think about that in Spanish and it's something I'm still even 10 years after starting learning Spanish, I'm still figuring that out a little bit. In French, it's a lot less important. And it's funny because you would think that in thinking less about making mistakes and in not worrying about it, you would make a lot more, right? Because obviously, if you're thinking about doing it right, you'll do it right. Well, not always. If you're thinking about doing it right, a lot of the time you're thinking too hard and you're gonna lose that natural part that your brain already has. You're using your logical brain to do something that in your native language you do with your reactionary or instinctive brain. And so I actually my first week in France, I was talking to the study abroad director who is a native French speaker, and I told her that I don't think about grammar when I speak French. And she said, "Really? Because you don't make very many mistakes at all. You make a lot less mistakes than students who have studied for years. And it's not that I'm some genius or anything. It's just that your brain already has a system built in to learn languages and to repeat patterns and to absorb and I could go into a huge tangent. If you want to look it up, it's called System 1 and System 2 processing. Okay. So it's all about and this is something that's not in the language field usually. I actually encountered it in the marketing field, but let's say you want to buy a product. Depending on the product you buy, a lot of the decision making you have, especially if it's a cheaper product, is instantaneous. Oh, I like that packaging. Oh, that looks good. That burger looks tasty, right? You don't analyze all these things logically. Sometimes, well, and so it's the same processing that our brains use to play sports, you know. If someone kicks you a soccer ball or a football, you don't you don't have to calculate the velocity and the distance traveled and do all these, the angle that it's rotation. Your brain can instantly do all of that, and it can use the same system for language.
Mhm. So that would be what were they say those things again? Like system one and
System one and system two. So
so
system
system
one, system one
sound
processing is instinctual. It's really
yeah,
fast.
okay.
And system two is logical. A lot of us try and use our logical processing to learn languages, which takes a lot more energy.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I can rock with that. That's kind of like I would call the subconscious mind and the conscious mind. So the conscious mind being the logical, the one you're thinking about things and okay, what's that to do with that? And like thinking about like the mechanics of something, of the grammar or whatever. And then the subconscious mind is exactly like you said, how we learn languages. You can also think about it in the way of like right brain and left brain kind of way, like the right brain being more like creative and open. That's the way languages should be taught in a very like holistic way rather than like a logical kind of breaking everything up into bits. And I love that what you said about yeah, your French and the reaction. You don't make many mistakes. And like, yes, because you don't care about them. You probably have made a lot more mistakes. This is what I say to my students. Like, I make loads of mistakes, but I don't see them as mistakes. So I don't obsess over them. And also the amount you can get out of an interaction with another person, aside from the fact you're relaxed and they enjoy speaking to you because you're a fun person to talk to, because you're interested in them and not their language necessarily. Um, because your brain's in a more relaxed like state, it's just so much easier to like get into that flow state you mentioned.
Yeah.
And learn.
Let's talk about that relaxed state. This is something I know that's important to you. I mean, the name of your company or your organization, Laid Back Languages.
Yeah.
Um, if we're talking about logical brain and instinctual brain, um, if you're stressed, and this is something really interesting. A lot of people we've recently learned, not really recently, but everyone's is arriving at the understanding that stress can be good, right? There's eustress as opposed to just what is it? De-stress, right? Distress. There's eustress, which is EU stress. It's positive. It helps you to learn, but that almost never works with a language. And the reason for that is because a language is so complex that um, being stressed, that your brain has to be open to everything. Everything's new, new words, new ideas, new structures. You have to be so open that stress, what it does is it shuts your mind down. And this is why you'll see like people who've practiced hours and hours and hours for their piano recital, or let's say, and when they get into the performance, they all of that washes out because the stress just clamps down on their brain and it can't do what it knows how to do, even though they could do it with their eyes closed. Otherwise, stress really can take control of your brain, and you have to be relaxed if you want to get into this. You said flow state. I like that. You can't be in that flow state if you're stressed out. It's really, really important to be relaxed as much as you possibly can.
Exactly. And let's look at the etymology of flow, fluid, fluidity, fluency. The
Okay.
clues are in the
All
words, right? You have to, if you want to think fluidly, you have to be like you're fluid, like relaxed. You can't be uptight and stressed. And yeah, that's that's the real key point. And yeah, like you mentioned, that's why I called my business laid back languages, because that's my approach. That was pretty much certainly at the beginning. There's other things and little things you can tweak and methods and whatnot to learn a language, but the main thing was that philosophy I had towards languages. I asked myself, like, how is it I've learned Spanish so much faster than this other guy who was living in Madrid for like 10 years and I'd been there for 2 years. I was like, how am I having fluent conversations with people and he's really struggling? Like, what's the difference between what am I doing? And that philosophy, I guess, is a massive part of it. Like, I didn't care. And going back to something you mentioned, which I want to pick up on just before we finish up,
Mm-hmm.
you have feeling like a bit nervous, or not nervous, but you being harder on yourself when you speak Spanish than you are when you speak French. I have the exact same thing, but with French and not Spanish. And my theory is because French was my first foreign language. I had a lot of that conditioning from school still, you know. I was learning French, and even when even now, I'll speak French and I'll be like, oh man, oh, my French isn't that good, or like, oh, I made a mistake there. Do you know? I'm a lot harder on myself with French than any other language. And I remember when I started learning Spanish, I learned it so much quicker, not just because of the experience learning French and knowing a Romance language. That obviously helps, right? The
Mm-hmm.
main thing was my attitude. I was like, my third language, I don't give a shit if I make a mistake. What are you crazy? I don't care. I was just there speaking to everyone, interacting, and the Spanish people, they're great for that. They really love it. If you show an interest in them and their culture, they love it. They love that, like, gringos or guiris, as we say in Spain,
Okay.
speak their language and actually care about them and their culture. They
So,
uh
oh
they
yeah,
adore that.
I wanna clarify something that's actually a huge deal because you and me have kind of come upon a contradiction in this conversation. We we talked about the dumb tourist, right? Who they're just making mistakes all over the place and they're speaking terribly, and that's bad. Okay, so why is it good all of a sudden to or okay to make mistakes and just go for it. Well, there's a huge, huge difference between these two groups. And I really want to distinguish that because I don't want people thinking, oh, well, I just make all the mistakes possible. I don't even care. Like I'll just do it and then like it'll work out. The real difference is how are you treating people? Okay. So are you treating people like they need to come to your level, like it's all about you, like they need to learn from you and do what you do and treat you the way you want to, or are you learning from them? And this is a huge, huge problem that we have in the world, no matter what country you. So for example, I don't know how it is in England, but in the US, if you say you're going somewhere like Mexico or, well, I don't know, Honduras, anywhere south of the border, people think it's a humanitarian trip. They think you're going to build houses. And I hate that because you don't, and I've gone on humanitarian trips and you don't learn about people when you go. You don't really learn how people are. What you learn is that they need your help. So you're going and they need you, they need what you know. Most of the people who go on those trips to build houses, they don't know how to build a house. They learn there. So when you go to another country, you don't go to teach them what you know and to show them who you are. You go to learn what they have to teach you. And I don't care what country you go to. You could go to the poorest country in the world. You could go where people are using tarps and tents made out of sticks and rocks to as their house. Those people have something to teach you that you didn't know before, and you need to learn that from them. You need to listen. If you're in their country, if you're speaking their language, you're there to learn. And that's a huge, huge um, principle that I really feel passionately about that it's okay to make mistakes in learning. It's not okay to make mistakes in trying to show people how to do your thing, how to be your, you've got to go to learn.
Yeah, exactly. Love that. We'll wrap up on that point. Comes back to humility, doesn't it? Like super humbling process learning a language. And the more humble you are, the faster you learn. And it's not like you become more like it doesn't boost your ego because language learning is a very humbling process. You can kind of be great speaking fluently, amazing one day. The next day you wake up, you're like, oh my God, I can't
Oh
remember
yeah.
anything. But
Yeah.
that's like it's a humbling process. So start off being humble, and it'll be a much smoother ride for you. Man, I've can't thank you enough. I've loved this conversation. Shout out your Instagram again so people can go and follow you. It's Isaac,
Yeah, so my language thoughts with
yeah,
the little what's it called? A
an underscore,
underline
isn't it? Yeah,
underscore.
nice one. I'll drop it in the description box below. Isaac, thank you
Perfect.
so much. It's been an absolute honor, and I look forward to speaking to you in the future, man.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been great.